your seat. We are about to start. Hi, Preeti. Are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Yes, Preeti, pleasure to meet you again here. Well, I think we've known each other, right? Long time ago. So yes, so we will start the session very soon, and I think you will speak after Shufa. I think.
That's fine.
All right. Okay, let's get started. I would like to call all the panelists to come up front, please. Professor Nathan Hullman, Shufa, Preeti joined from Washington, D.C. online, Nora, and my dear friend Kuki Sujahmun. Kuki, please. Well, I'm among the fine ladies. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a very, I think, friendly session. I see a lot of friendly face here. And welcome to this session, Global Convergence in Climate Actions. And today's session is supported by LPM FAUE, but also I would like to thank Ford Foundation for their support for the think tank meeting, T20 Summit. Today, this morning, we are going to talk about global convergence in climate actions. As you know, that the windows for meeting Paris Agreement goal, 1.5 degree, is closing. So based on IPCC report, which I know Frank is one of the lead author here, also it indicated that we have less than a decade to reach our emission peak and start to fall to reach net zero emission by the mid of this century. Well, this is not easy one, and before Glasgow, we know that country has been asked to submit their pledge, and based on the latest pledge, even though with all that promise, all that still we are not reach 1.5 degrees, still well below if all countries who committed start to do their, implement their promise into the action. So this session is about how we are going to ensure that to happens. And there is a couple of policy and strategy that countries may have came up. We have NDC, National Determined Contributions, and long-term climate strategy, I think is also required by UNFCCC. And some countries have low emission development strategies, and so on. So, but that's all pledge and plan. So, you know that the problem with the plan, sometimes they can be implemented, sometimes not. It depends on the circumstances. But today we are going to discuss how we could make sure that all the plans can be implemented effectively, and what is actually the role of this wonderful group, the think tank that have influence, I think, in every aspect of the policies, from government, private business, civil society, and others. So today I have, and this morning, I have a very excellent panels. We have Professor Nathan Hullman from University of Maryland, and we have Shufa Rafa from Council on Energy, Environment and Water, India. We have Preeti Bandari joining us from Washington, D.C., from World Resource Institute. Good evening, Preeti. Yes, I think it's quite late, I know, in D.C. right now. And we have Nora Mansuri from Kapsak, Saudi Arabia, right? And my friends Kuki Sujahmun from Indonesia Research Institute for Decarbonizations and also T20 TF3 lead co-chairs. Welcome to this panel. Ladies and gentlemen, we will start with all the panelists making presentations on the topic that they assign, and then later on we will have some talks, and then I hope you can join also in the conversation. And we have like slightly now, well, we have 80 minutes left to our session. So I will start with Nate Hultman. You will talk about the risk of achieving global net zero emission. Nate, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Fabi, and it is a great pleasure to be here with all of these panelists, amazing panelists, and I'm very excited about our conversation with the group of us as well as this room. I think we can have a good discussion, and it'll be interesting and I think enlightening. So let's do this. I have a few slides that I prepared, but I think let's get through them quickly so we can get to the good part, which is the other panelists. So let's if we could get the slides up, I'll just run through those very briefly. So my topic that I was speaking of today is risks of achieving a global net zero economy. Now, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to cover that entire topic very well. So what I'm going to do is just sort of give you a sense of how I see that question. And I think it is actually an extension of Fabi's intro, where he said, we can make plans and we can make goals, but sometimes we don't know how to necessarily implement. And I've been sort of working on both the planning and the implementation side in the context of the US, and we do a lot of collaborative work with other groups around and sort of see how things work in lots of other people of our country if we deliver a sort of global net zero by 2050 or whatever. So I don't know if you can see the slides here. We can see them on the screen, but well, we actually, given that there we go. Okay, so we'll do this very briefly. So risks in achieving. Next slide, please. So this next slide is really just one example. If you can flip to the next one, it's just one example from many, many studies that are similar of what Fabi was talking about, which is that, we're, in terms of where the NDCs are currently getting us, even if fully implemented, we know they're not going to get us to where we need to be. Now, we are in a much better place than we were 10 years ago, by the way. So I will kind of note that significant action has been taken by many countries, including many of the G20 countries. We're making progress. Like this is, we used to be much worse off when I started doing this stuff, 10 years ago. So we are making progress, but you can see that little dot there that says NDCs. That's kind of where we're going. And beyond that, we can see that to kind of adhere to the 1.5 or 2-degree pathways, more needs to be done. So everybody knows this story. That's just to kind of like level set where we are. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is an example from the US. So when I recently last year was working with the US on John Kerry's team, and I was leading the writing of this is our planning document, like the US long-term strategy report, which was released at COP26. And this is just one figure from it, which is essentially a similar version of that global story, which is like, given the global story, here's what the US goals are, right? So we have a 2025 goal, a 2030 goal, and actually 2035 goal that doesn't show up here exactly, but then also a net zero 2050 goal. And that's one example of how each country then has to implement its own specific set of policies and its own specific strategy, as Fabi mentioned in the intro, to get to that sort of long-term net zero goal. And so all of us in our own country contexts in some ways have been working not only in the global conversation, but also in our national and sometimes even subnational conversations of how do states or cities even do more. Next slide, please. So this is just an example, like this is the US work on the top left, but there's lots of other work that like we've been involved in, but other people have been doing, which is essentially this first phase of how do you do the analysis of the pathway to success, right? And then communicate that not only with our policymakers, but also start using that as a basis for communicating with the broader civil society. And that's a critical step. It's what I do for my research, but also we all know is not nearly enough to just make the plan and throw it out there. So then that gets us to my final slide, which we'll flip to now, if we can go to the next one, which is really just some sense of, as I've had these conversations, this is my view, there's lots of other ways, if we can go to the next one, there's lots of ways that this question of what is needed to support our policy communities, that's a conversation that will be unique in each country, right? But there are some common themes that I'm drawing from here that come up a lot in the US context, but also I think are broadly applicable. But this is where getting to the question of the panel today, what are the kinds of ways that we can minimize the risks of not achieving our high ambition goals? I think that one of the ways that we can support and contribute as the research community is to help answer these questions, is to give good, robust answers to questions like, how does a rapid energy transition improve public health outcomes? How does it improve people's lives by reducing mortality, reducing illness, allowing people to work more because they're not homesick, right? Like, how does that link into the broader economy? A second is broader questions which are even harder to answer of like quality of life and justice. And those are questions that come up in different ways in every country. And I want to kind of recognize that. But nevertheless, like, how do you think about different groups of people? For example, sometimes indigenous people in different countries have specific needs and sort of, situations that need to be talked about. And so how do we as a research community sensitively understand and present some support for how to get an energy transition that will work broadly enough to support a politics that will allow for implementation, right? Economic growth, we all know that story, right? So everybody wants economic growth, everybody wants development, and we definitely do. And so how does this energy transition then manifest in different ways? There's a lot of scope still for innovation in the research, and when I say innovation, I mean just research and methodological innovation for how to understand that set of questions. Reducing conflict, I think there's lots of mechanisms there which I won't go into. And then finally, something we've heard a lot in the first day of the T20 yesterday, which is financing and business models. So I think that's just a few that I kind of have seen. I think there are lots more, and others will no doubt add to that list. Thank you.
Thank you, Need. Thank you, Need. I think you have highlighted in your last slide this very important point, how we can avoid, we can mitigate the risk not meeting the Paris climate goals, right? I think it's very, very important, and I think the science is very clear between 1.5 and 2 even. If we meet 2 degrees and below 2 degrees, there is a very distant difference, stark difference, I think, in terms of the economic growth, the cost, because failing meeting that. So I mean, for sure we have to do our best to meet these goals. Next, I will give the floor to Shufa, from Council on Energy, Environment and Water, India, that will be also chair G20 next year.
Yes.
Shufa.
So, okay, I also have a set of 3 slides, if I may please have those. And good morning to my fellow panelists, good morning moderator, and thank you for having me here. It's a great privilege, and it's also a great bridge, as the moderator said, to India's G20 presidency, which is coming up in 2023. Though we have been working in Troika with Italy, and now we'll be working in Troika with Brazil as well, so it's a very interesting melange of viewpoints and issues that we're working with. And are we transmitting the slides onto Zoom? Then I can start. My subject for today is about the global convergence in climate action. And well, it's positioned as mitigation versus adaptation in the global south perspective, but I want to start a little bit by saying that the whole point and the whole way to achieve success in the 2030 agenda or the climate crisis is to move from the margins to the mainstream and stop framing things in binaries of south, north, developed, not developed, emerging, not emerging, fossil fuel, not fossil fuel, and so on and so forth. There are many, many binaries that we have siloed ourselves into, which is actually restricting the policy, research, and governance questions that confront us. Now, one important thing that's coming up in 2023 is going to be the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. And this comes in the wake of the World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report 2022, which has identified climate action failure, extreme weather, and diversity loss as the top 3 global risks. And also in the top 10 are human environmental damage and natural resources crisis, which are all listed above the debt crisis. So that's the kind of importance that's being given right now in the economic mainstream to this crisis facing us. And if we do a little bit of a stock take, and can I have the next slide, please? Here is, sorry, before I move on, and here's something that we're doing to mainstream the climate thought in India, because it's something that has been restricted, and a lot of this has to do with the think tanks who prefer being exclusive, being inclusive, being a closed group, being very, very academic and research oriented, and we realize that that's not going to get us the people's mandate or the political will to make these changes. And so we have very constructively started reaching out to the citizens and the government at large, both at the national, subnational, and international levels, through social media, through mass media, through events that engage them in ways that they understand and they can connect it to their context. So now as we go into stock take, here's a little bit of stock take on where the global north and the south are right now. And this is not to assign blame, but it's more to bring into focus that we are all, north or south, in a similar situation because climate crisis affects us all. Next slide, please. So if we see here, and if you see the first circle, it basically shows that little red thing. If you see, that is the 3.7% emissions reduction that has happened in the industrialized countries between 1990 and 2019. The larger greens are the emissions reductions that have come from the destruction of the erstwhile USSR, where the emissions were reduced not because of mitigation or adaptation effects, but because industrialization had collapsed in those countries. So essentially, we only have 3.7% emissions reduction in the developed nations, as we say it. And they have also exceeded their allotted carbon allowance significantly already. Also, another important thing that we are working towards is having the metrics that are being used reflect the reality of the situation. And in that sense, we feel that the global north must acknowledge that in per capita terms, many of the top carbon emitters are from their camp. And a little bit of example of that. The average Canadian and American emits twice as much as an average Chinese, though we hear China getting a lot of the flag for climate crisis. Even though about 1/3 of all energy-intensive global manufacturing is taking place in China, as compared to only 18% in the US. 14 countries in the global north are among the top 30 carbon emitters per capita. India is not even in the top 100. And 12% of the world's population residing in the global north countries are responsible for around 1/3 of all emissions. So these numbers put things in perspective, because when we take cumulative, and the global south has very large populations, ascribing that situation only to one side of the earth, if you will not take us to the targets that have been set either individually by the countries or collectively in the Paris Agreement. Now moving on, if we can have the next slide, please. Yes, so now we come to the community and the impact of jobs, growth, and sustainability in mainstreaming the climate dialogue. And we feel, after a lot of research, and this is something my council works on deeply, that leveraging the green energy transition and the economic transformation that comes with it by way of network governance processes can have a double leapfrog effect for these emerging economies and developing countries, where they go from not only the energy transition, but it also brings in developmental activities, poverty eradication, employment, and so on and so forth. And when we bring all these points together is when the political will is created to go for big ticket changes, for the investors to get the right signals from the governments and bring in the money. And there are two things that we have identified that is my emphasis today, is the access to technology and the focus on technology co-development and the role of blended finance and not the traditional climate finance as we know. And we all agreed that frontier technologies need to be disseminated at the same places globally to have an even energy transition. where we have actually studied about several multilateral clean energy initiatives of the last decade. That's 2010 to 2021. And we have seen that only 2 of these out of 36 are focusing at a subnational level. So global initiatives are staying at a very, very high level. It's staying with certain northern or developed country perspectives, and this is preventing them from being inclusive and accountable to individual countries' economic, political, and social indicators. And the reach to go into the ground level is very limited. And also only one, and that too launched in 2021, explicitly aims to strengthen the South-South cooperation. And that is where convergence between the South is also not happening. And that's something, again, that we think tanks who are in the South, who are working with policymakers, need to constructively look at. There's only one initiative that's doing that. And very few overall of these 36 even go beyond knowledge exchange and include any R&D. Very few are focused on real technology and equipment or joint dissemination mandates. It's all very, very preliminary. And coming to the adaptation and mitigation very quickly, I just want to say that it's not an either or which one do you suggest. I think that ship has sailed to some extent. We have done a lot of work on mitigation, and by we I mean the world, some amount of it on adaptation, and really nothing on loss and damages is something that we won't even talk about anymore. It's that white elephant we keep parked behind. But without these, we can't move forward. And when we talk of these, innovations become important. And innovations not only at the absolute elite Ivy league level, or which are only IPRs or which are licensed, but also local innovation that are happening in every country in line with the cultural preferences of those countries, the social conditions, the weather conditions, the affordability and accessibility of those technologies. And we really must have some way of globalizing these innovations, which right now do not have a platform. And one very small example that I have given is on distributed renewable energy, which is now seen as something to light some solar bulbs here or charge a mobile phone there. It's given very, very preliminary, primitive uses. However, we see decentralized energy as that mechanism to actually bring affordable energy to all the unserved populations, and maybe eventually also to major cities and urban areas, which are very niche needs and do not need the whole grid to go into this. So these sort of innovations, and there's a program that we are running called Powering Livelihoods. It's a $3 million program that we're doing with certain investors to commercialize on-ground technologies that small businesses, especially women, are doing in rural areas. Because how do we then get them engaged into the mainstream economy, which directly leads to mitigation in that spaces, adaptation of those local populations, and co-benefits of jobs and poverty alleviation, health benefits, like Nate was saying, that there are many related actions and reactions to that. And we've seen that these are people who are using renewable energy for, let's say, running their looms, or running milk chillers, or running the agricultural pumps. And these are not very small scale. They are reaching around thousands of people, 10,000, 12,000 people in each enterprise, and now they become large enough to have branches across the country, recruit more people. Almost 40% are women, so it's something that we see is really serving the gender empowerment at the grassroots level. And each of these are innovations that can and should be scaled up at a global level. And I come to my final point now. May I have the last slide, please? And this is about the blended finance. And we talk a lot about finance, or those big numbers, millions, trillions, transformative, any number. I mean, lots of people have lots of numbers. But the point is, where is this money? We are not seeing it in actual play. We're definitely not seeing it in the global south. But more importantly, what we are looking into as a think tank is, why are we not seeing this money? I mean, what is the real problem? Where is it stuck? And then if you see, we've identified four areas that one is the ambiguity. I mean, people do not know where to go, what to invest in, which is a legitimate enterprise, which is not. There are no certifying bodies that are globally saying. I mean, there are certain initiatives like the International Solar Alliance, which is now trying to bring together projects and reduce the cost of finance or the risks, the sovereign risks that come with it. Very fledgling initiatives. We also have that the flow is limited, the private capital is not flowing. Many of these projects in the global south are sovereign funded, and we also have, and I'll just wrap up in 1 minute. We also have the solution to that we are seeing is not just to have one type of finance. We need to look at a mix of baskets, and one would be for large-scale deployment of renewable energy, or let's say hydrogen technology, or any new technology that's coming up, but at scale, because you're also serving billions of people with that technology. A second one that we have is to de-risk. And you know, the cost of finance till it comes down is it's not going to be deployable. And transition finance is different from climate finance or sustainability finance, because that is the ecosystem that's undergoing a change. And one that relates to the direct ecosystem, we're losing jobs, getting jobs, and so on and so forth. Processes are being changed. Industrial decarbonization is very expensive. But also parallel systems such as digitalization to deliver those services. Those networks must also come up in parallel to support this. And then we have financing the research and development, of course, I mean, that's where we come in. And also the insurance mechanisms for infrastructure for people, which cost us money. Just next. So in conclusion, I would just like to say that there are many pieces missing of the puzzle that we need to bring in, and as think tanks, especially of the global south, we need to collaborate between each other. We also need to have a healthy and non-confrontational dialogue with our counterparts in the global north, who do come with very entrenched viewpoints. They are difficult to negotiate with, but the time is now. And I was very enthused by the launch of the research forum yesterday, the G20 research forum. I think that augurs really well for maintaining continuity at the G20 level between issues, and also ensuring that the issues do not get tightly entwined with the presidency's political priorities. And we can have a discussion that's based on facts and analytics and solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sufa. I think your last point is really make a good bridge to the next topic that we are going to discuss, or going to be presented by Preeti on the financing on climate action. And this is the missing piece, but we know that climate financing is one of the building block of global actions, and it support mitigation and adaptation. The question is, can we deliver in the situation like this, in the energy crisis, energy costs rise? So the question is whether we could hit this $100 billion by 2023. So I will give a floor to Zoom screen to Preeti, live from Washington, D.C. Preeti, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Fabi, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to this session. And Suva has provided, and you have provided the right segue into the question that was posed to me on, can we commit to financing climate action? And you have outlined the current scenario that we are in, various crises, multiple crises, limited public financing. I'd like to make 5 points over here. And my first point is, the question that was posed, it is not about can we make a commitment to financing, as we are already committed. And for this, I'd like to give you the evidence that in 2019, 2020, a little over 630 billion of climate financing did take place at the global level, and 75% of it was raised and spent in the same country. So the financing is taking place, but this leads to my second question, which is what I would like to pose, that it is not about can we, but how can we do it better, bigger, and faster? And there was some reference made to the trillions. The estimates are around 4.5 to 5 trillion per year. And, there can be debates about the numbers, but the scale is large. And public finance alone cannot deliver, as we know. And with the current crisis that we are in, public finance is getting even more limited and diverted to other critical issues or critical events that are taking place. So the moot point is, how can this limited public finance mobilize other sources of finance like private sector finance or innovative sources of finance? And Suva in her presentation did talk about blended finance vehicles and the like. But having said that, there are some, who talk that there's not adequate funding available. But the recent assessment by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the third point I'd like to make over here, is that there is sufficient global capital and liquidity to close the investment gaps for a 2-degree transition that we are talking about. And it's not only 2-degree, the ambition is to reach 1.5 degree if we can. However, this global capital is misallocated. And herein lies, the question of what are the enabling environments, which are the rightly or not, risk perceptions that are inhibiting this capital to flow where it is needed to meet the global public goods objectives. So the 100 billion is only one part of the story, if I may say so. 100 billion was a compact. The needs are much larger. And for that, we have to look at different models. But I'll come to this point later. My next point relates to when we talk about climate action, there is a preponderance to talk about mitigation. And, mitigation financing, which to some may sound correct, because if we do not mitigate more, there will be more needed for adaptation. However, we are already living in a 1.1 degree temperature increase world, and climate impacts are unfolding with a ferocity that we have not witnessed before. And, the recent floods in Pakistan have shown us and also the other impacts that are unraveling across the globe have shown us that we are in a climate emergency. I mean, the government of Pakistan has clearly said that, the tab for recovery is as big as $10 billion by this one incident of flooding, which has impacted 1/3 of the country. And the needs are huge. And again, the issue of loss and damage is coming to the fore. It can no longer be ignored. And all the development gains that have been made in the last decade are now undoing themselves. So again, it is a question of here and now and the willingness to do it. And therein lies the role of G20 also, because meeting the climate goals implies transformations in the financial architecture as well, and especially if we have to challenge the trillions. And the UN FCCC process has its limitations. It cannot do it on its own. So herein again lies the role of G20 and the leadership of G20, not only to meet the challenge of climate action and financing it, but if I can add to it also exhibiting solidarity with vulnerable countries, which I think at this point in time, the vulnerable countries are not seeing G20 being as responsive and acting in a more globally responsible manner. So that is what I'd like to end with, the challenge, the role that G20 can play, not only in those 20 countries, but also in building global solidarity for climate action. Thank you. Back to you, Fabi.
Thank you, Preeti. It's very clear what needs to be done and what's lack actually. And I just want to cite what is actually required, because Preeti mentioned that $100 billion is just one part, right? And Irina's report said that just to implement the renewable energy target in the NDCs from 2015 to 2030, it requires $1.7 trillion investment. And that's average 110 billion in average from 2015 to 2030. And we know that it's actually lack of that amount. So that's the scale of investment that's really need, financing that really need. And the question is how actually this 100 billion, which has to well, divided equally for mitigation and adaptations, and adaptation cost is even larger, right? Can stimulate investment in this direction. So that's the challenge that we have to address, and what would be the recommendation from T20 in this, mobilizing climate finance. And yeah, but that's also part of the kind of the discussion. It's all the climate action require cooperation. So what kind of cooperation and who would like to cooperate? So I would like to give Nora Mansuri to answer this question from Kapsar. Please, Nora, floor is yours.
Thank you, Fabi, and I'd like to thank the T20. It's been a tremendous effort over the year, and I was happy to contribute as a co-chair of Task Force 3. So for this panel, which is entitled The Global Convergence on Climate Action, when we talk about global convergence and cooperation, I have 3 points. The first is that energy security cannot be taken for granted. If anything, the current events triggered by the conflict in the Ukraine, in an already fragile world recovering from COVID-19, you know, with all the disruptions in energy supply, food crisis, energy crisis, and also inflation and stagflation, reminds us that reminds us of the costs of a disruptive energy transition and an abrupt energy transition. So energy security re-emerges as a top priority in the global agenda, and this is also impacting energy use in Europe, impacting the climate targets in Europe, particularly the Green Deal, as some of the European countries were reverting back to coal, and this is in strict opposition to the outcome of COP26 of the phase down of unabated coal, which was the pledge from COP26. So all of this show us how national priorities shift and governments' focus increase. And so critical minerals such as, you know, lithium, graphite, cobalt, nickel, manganese, and rare earths need to keep up with the global demand and investments across all energy options, including hydrocarbons, have to keep up to ensure a smooth and reliable energy transition. Which takes me to the third point, which is that for global convergence and for global cooperation, climate action has to be sustainable. So in order to ensure the sustainability, reliability, and resilience of climate action, it has to be inclusive. And the circular carbon economy, which was formulated under the Saudi G20 presidency, really ensures that. It supports a just energy transition. It also supports the full energy technologies and energy options, and it really shifts the discussion from the sources of energy to managing these emissions, as enshrined in the Paris Agreement of Article 4. So if we do that, if we allow climate action to be as inclusive, as flexible, and offer countries the opportunity to choose their climate action based on their national circumstances, then we ensure having a sustainable climate action that's not interrupted by shifting global priorities such as COVID-19 or the conflict in Ukraine. So this is really the message here, is to ensure the inclusivity of climate action, the flexibility of climate action, and the resilience and sustainability of it. Thank you.
Smoothly sail the energy transitions, but also kind of the policy instrument and this policy.
I think when we are talking about global convergence, then we need to understand that it's not only for one specific stakeholders, it has to include everyone, right? So I think the first thing that we need to remember is that everyone, all stakeholders need to get involved and need to play a role in these climate actions. And the role of us, before I come to the carbon pricing, I think the role of us in Think 20 as well as other think tank and research institute is basically to help all stakeholders. Right? So to how do you call it? To make them understand about the issue, but also to offer potential, solutions, and that can be done not only, in the country for each country, but as already mentioned earlier by the other resource person, also collaboration, and this is something that we need to do. And with that, I would like to come to the carbon pricing issue, because for most of developing countries, I think carbon pricing is something new, relatively new, and this is where us as research center and think tank society can help the government for each country to build that kind of, to develop the carbon pricing both in the country domestically, but also how to address the international or carbon issues, right? Because one of the, I think, the challenge, if I can say, is we've heard about this carbon border adjustment mechanism. This is something that, on the one hand, will help climate actions around the world, because everyone will have to have a certain level or certain standard of carbon pricing. But this is also a challenge for developing countries, because most of developing countries, they don't have the carbon pricing policy in place. And this is something that, of course, the government will need to play a role. They need to support each other, but also from our, society, from the research center and the think tank also, we need to work together to help each other on how each of us can also help our own government, at least, to have that certain level of carbon pricing that can be accepted, if I can say, and can be used for addressing this, or not addressing, but to be in the system with the CBAM, for example. So I think that's one of the things that I see the importance of carbon pricing. And if we are talking about carbon pricing, it's not only, the one in the country, but also this international one, which also can be a great avenue for, I think Sufa mentioned earlier, and the other also, about this technology transfer. How we can develop technology, how can we exchange, because for most of developing countries, even though we have, Sufa, you mentioned about local technology that appropriate for local activities, but there are also advanced technologies that we need. And one of the area that we, or one of the means that we can do that is through international carbon market, for example, or maybe it's not market, but like all this carbon related issue. And on the socioeconomic as well, because Article 6.4, and there are also discussion now how to introduce such things for voluntary carbon market. So I think for me, we have a great opportunity to help all governments to address this issue in a more maybe cost-efficient way. Thanks, Fab.
Thank you, Kuki. I think that's the challenge for G20 country. Not all the G20 countries have implemented carbon pricing as well, and some countries just started, but some countries certainly not. And I think that's the key. And I think there's a couple of research, including one from IMF, that suggested, and World Bank IMF has stated that, well, at least you have global $50 of carbon tax, right, to ensure we can reach this Paris goals. But also there's critics, so that how effective is actually carbon tax, carbon pricing, and addressing this target. Well, that's, I think, another topic to discuss. But I would like to turn to all these panelists. You have shared your views, and one of the still, I think, one of the important one is that country has met pledge, right? And there's a couple of analysis showing that, well, again, we'll not really, well, we are well below 2 degrees, but not really reach this 1.5 degree, which we know very important. And but country made pledge before Glasgow or during the big ceremony, state address in Glasgow, right? So I think it's already like what, 7 months from that. How do you see this from your country perspective, how effective the commitment that they made before Glasgow or in Glasgow with the reality today? What's new? Whether countries can deliver that pledge after 7 months? So that's the questions from your perspective, of also from G20 perspective. G20 country perspective. So I will start with Nate. What's going on with the US?
Yeah, well, for once I actually feel like I have a good answer to that question. So, I think the first piece I would mention is that first of all, absolutely correct. A number of countries put forward more ambitious NDCs around Glasgow, before, during, maybe a little after. So that's good. I would say not every G20 necessarily put forward absolutely highest ambition target, and I think that's got to be something that we continue to think about and highlight as the research community, because the G20 does, as it was mentioned yesterday, does to some degree make or break the 1.5 pathway. It's really, if we do focus on this group of countries, that's something like 80% of the overall ability to hit 1.5 with this group of 20 countries. And so I think Indonesia's been very good stepping in and doing ambitious target setting and thinking about how it can do that, but I don't think everybody's there yet. So that's one thing just to note, is that that's going to have to be a continued drumbeat of continued raising of ambition in the target setting dimension. And this is even before we get to the implementation, but just in terms of is there high enough ambition to get us to 1.5 or even close to 2? We're not quite there yet. And the G20 is, to my mind, the right forum to be thinking about, or the right group of countries, I should say, not necessarily the forum, but the right group of countries to be thinking about in terms of how we get there. Now, back to the U.S. The U.S. is actually, I'll say this briefly, and we can talk more if people want to, but the U.S. put out, as people know, a target of 50 to 52% reductions below 2005 by 2030, and a net zero 2050. We've articulated exactly what that means on the long-term strategy, and I am happy to report that we do have some legislation now forthcoming from Congress, both through an initial sort of down payment last year before Glasgow and an infrastructure act that Congress passed, as well as, of course, the very probably visible and kind of dramatic up and down in the U.S. climate policy world over the course of the last 6 or 8 months, where we did get eventually a good set of legislative outcomes from our Congress. I will also note in the U.S., it's not just Congress that drives forward climate action, it's also our regulatory system. So there's 3 buckets. It's Congress, what can Congress do? Second, what can the regulatory apparatus do at the federal level? That includes regulatory actions rooted in existing laws from EPA, DOE, Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Energy, others like that. And that continues apace. That will continue to roll forward, I think, for sure under the Biden administration for the next few years, couple of years at least. And then there's also, I just want to note, in the U.S., we have a highly, what I'll use the word, federalized system, where there's a lot of policy authorities that are delegated. It's not all at the national level. So there's a lot of policy levers that exist at the state, or even for some cases, city, municipalities, counties, these other kinds of smaller things. But in the U.S., there's kind of a distribution of who does what. So for example, states in the U.S. have a tremendous amount of leverage on electricity policy. They can make renewables targets, and that group of actors has actually been very active in pushing ahead as well. So I actually would say that I've been doing this for a long time, and usually it's been a harder question to answer. Now I feel better about where we're heading, and I think, it doesn't mean that we're there yet. I like to tell people it's, we still need to kind of continue to do work over the course of the decade, but we're getting there.
Thank you. And Shufa,
Thank you.
India?
Yes, so India makes fairly ambitious targets given the population that we are working with. So we are slated to now be the most populous country in the world in the next couple of years, 1.4 billion plus. We made fairly aggressive commitments at COP21 in 2015. We had targeted 175 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity at a time when we had 32 gigawatts. And we also had committed to 40% power generation from non-fossil sources by 2030. And we had also committed to an emissions intensity reduction of 33 to 35% over our GDP over 2015 levels by 2030. Now, as of COP26, we have achieved that 40% from the non-fossil fuel sources. And so we have set a new target now of 50%. We've also upped the renewable energy capacity target to 500 gigawatts by 2030 from 175 because we've already reached around 152 gigawatts in the last few years. And the emissions reduction also, we are at the last report that we made, the government report in 2020, if I'm not mistaken, we'd already reached 24%, we'll meet that target. But now with 500 gigawatts, we have to install something like 10.5 megawatts every hour. So in the time that we're sitting here, we should have installed about 10 megawatts of renewable energy. And also the target of non-fossil based power 50%, that's a moving target because India is rapidly industrializing and not everybody even has electricity yet. We have done the electrical coverage. Now we're looking at 24/7 electricity access, high quality access. The industry, the MSME needs high quality, reliable electricity or energy. So that 50% will just keep moving as the capacity increases, and that is where the challenge comes in because all these developing countries, they need ongoing source of innovation and finance and policy work. Like Nate said, we have also a federal state system, so the national policies are set by the central government, but then the states also have their own policies. And one interesting thing about being an electoral democracy such as we are is that the politicians get to decide much of your energy or economic transformation, and populist measures such as giving free electricity or subsidized power or not transitioning from existing systems such as coal because of the job losses to the extent of not even exploring new options or resisting investment depending on which party is in power. These are challenges that exist on the ground and they form real and perceived risks for such investments. But overall, India and our Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, they're extremely sustainability oriented. As a country, we are nature oriented. We are frugal in our resource use. We see that as India gets more industrialized, we need to look at the supply chains of critical minerals, of renewables, of hydrogen. And as Noura mentioned, I think it's important that we will continue to use an energy basket, and elimination of a type of fuel become less important than offsetting the emissions or reducing the emissions through other measures, because our aim is not to replace fuels but to reduce emissions, and we will stay focused on that. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll go to Preeti now. I think, Preeti, what's new in terms of in the financing side, and because the pledge not only about mitigation but also on financing side. Is there anything new after Glasgow?
Well, Fabi, as we all know, since we started with the 100 billion question in this discussion, 100 billion commitment that was made to get developing countries to take meaningful mitigation action, that 100 billion pledge has not been met. It was very well recognized in the text of Glasgow also, that has been a promise not kept. There has been a delivery plan which indicated, at least at Glasgow, that the pledge would be made in 2023. There is an update of that delivery plan, which is going to be unveiled before the next climate COP, COP27, in an interaction, Germany and Canada, which are holding the pen on both on the delivery plan and its update, with certain think tanks. We have made a plea to them that this time around the update should be more granular. And also, the pledge that was made, the new pledge that was made in Glasgow on adaptation. And again, I come back to adaptation because many of the countries in their NDCs have also talked about adaptation. And that is a very conscious, concerted effort by many developing countries to include adaptation in NDCs. And in terms of the announcement that was made of doubling of adaptation financing from 2019 levels by 2025 is also an important pledge that has been made, and an appeal has been made to both Canada and Germany that an update on this pledge would be very, very critical also for the upcoming discussions, especially since they're taking place in Africa, where the issue of adaptation is front and center. And also in the larger context, of the current crisis that we are in, where public funding is becoming meager, is that going to allow these pledges to fall off the chart again is something that will definitely erode the trust between developed and developing countries. So the update of the climate finance delivery plan is important on the finance front. The second thing that is important is the doubling of adaptation financing. But more importantly, the UN Secretary General's office is also, has set up a group to look at all the big pledges that were made at COP26. And, it's very good to make these big voluntary commitments and pledges, but to what extent are they going to be delivered? What are the accountability mechanisms? We need to see also, how they are being followed through. And therein also lies the role of think tanks like us in the transparency and accountability field of keeping that, pressure on in terms of various actors who have made voluntary commitments, but to ensure that there is no greenwashing taking place. So those are important things. COP26 was a high, but that high has to be maintained through delivery and through implementation.
Thank you, Preeti.
Thank you.
And I think since we started late, 10, 15 minutes late, so I think we still have 25 minutes? 20 minutes, all right. So I will continue to Nora and Cookie, and please make brief, and I will give opportunity also for the participants to comment and or questions. Please.
Thank you, Fabi. So to answer your question on Saudi Arabia's commitments, so the INDC, which became Saudi's first NDC, was 130 metric tons of CO2 per year, and just leading up to COP26, Saudi Arabia has doubled that to 278 metric tons of CO2. And also, during the same time, Saudi Arabia announced its net zero target of reaching net zero by 2060. And of course, this is coming from one of the largest oil economies and an oil exporter. So Saudi Arabia is using its oil revenues to invest in its hydrocarbons and upstream to ensure the stability and reliability of oil, but it's also using the oil revenues to translate into this climate roadmap towards net zero. So there was an important announcement last year as well, the launch of the Saudi Green Initiative and the Middle East Green Initiative to plant 10 billion trees across the kingdom and 40 billion trees across the region. It's already underway, it's on target. There are 450 million already planted. And since Saudi Arabia is a water-stressed region, the first question that comes to mind is how is it going to plant so many trees? And the answer is that Saudi is utilizing the blue carbon economy or nature-based solutions where a lot of the trees are in fact mangroves that use seawater, and this is great because there are co-benefits that come with that, preserving the ecosystem, but also mitigating some of the risks that comes with, fires in the forest and everything. And it's not doing that conditional to any funding. In fact, Saudi is partially funding the Middle East Green Initiative to help countries plant these 40 billion. So through this initiative, the aim is to reach the NDC target. But also there are other initiatives that Saudi has embarked upon, including diversifying of its energy mix to include 50% renewables and 50% gas by 2030. And there are grand plans for economic diversification, so that provides the co-benefits for climate action. But also hydrogen. Saudi has plans to be one of the largest green hydrogen producers in the NEOM plant, so using renewable energy. But there has been also cooperation with Japan, where the world's first shipment of blue ammonia, so using carbon capture and utilization, and this is evident how hydrocarbons can be used in a clean way to generate hydrogen and ammonia. It was shipped to Japan and used very cleanly in their power plants. Saudi is also home to the world's largest carbon capture and utilization plant. So this is at the heart of the circular carbon economy, where carbon is being so towards carbon circularity for carbon neutrality, to reuse and utilize carbon in industrial feedstock, and looking at it as a valuable feedstock rather than just a negative externality. So a lot has been done, and I'll leave it at that. I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Fabi.
Thank you. And it's very interesting one is NEOM, right? And I think this kind of the experiment on sustainable city. We'll see how the things progress. Yeah. Cookie, what's going on with our beloved country, Indonesia?
Yeah, I think Nate already mentioned earlier also, right? Basically in Glasgow, or before Glasgow, we sent our revised or updated NDC. But as you already know, that there was no increase of ambition or target. But after Glasgow, the president already basically assigned to have another revision of NDC that aligned with 1.5. Let's see how it will turn out later, hopefully before Sharm el-Sheikh. But I think what is also interesting is that Indonesia also announced this net zero emission for 2060. And in the follow sector, Indonesia also mentioned to have this net sink, right? Net sink in 2030 or by 2030. But I think, like one of the thing that we need to bear in mind and understand is that the government budget will not be enough, right? So this is something that we have to work together. So the financing need to come from different sources, not only from the national budget, but also from international as well as domestic other resources. And I think you mentioned also earlier about blended finance. And this is something that Indonesia is currently also promoting. I think it's already from some times ago, but this is the way that I think we can get hopefully enough resources to implement our NDC as well as the net zero target. So I think let's start with the question and answer.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I think it's time for you participants also to engage with the discussion. So I would like to have a couple of people, well, 3 people already. So I will start with a gentleman over there in the back, and then Frank, and then Gracia.
Thank you so much, Fabi. My name is Andre Akbar Martin. I'm a research director at the Asia Research Institution for Decarbonization. Hi, Fabi.
Sorry, Andre.
No, that's fine. Okay, thank you so much for all of the panelists for really insightful presentation. I think all of you has covered the issue of mitigation adaptation as the climate action sufficiently. However, I think there is another crucial issues of climate action that somehow these presentations has overlooked, which is loss and damage. So my short question to Suva and other panelists, whether it is a strategic or whether we could include the issue of loss and damage for the next G20, T20 presidency, and as well as for sure the G20 presidency. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'll continue with Frank.
Excuse me, colleagues. Excuse me, but some of this is really quite thoroughly depressing. We've heard some arguments that justify entrenched national positions. We've heard some traditional arguments against action by developing countries. We've heard some justifications for continued investment in fossil fuel projects. And so I wonder, what can we do to collectively lift our gaze, right, and look to the net zero futures that, our respective countries, not governments, but countries have committed to. And really, I think, in the end, when we look to India's presidency that's coming up, I think there's a really important question, actually, how T20 under the next presidency will be able to big question how T20 under the next presidency will be able to draw those kinds of forward-looking ideas into the process to actually support the G20 process, which is of course much harder we're having here. So that's what I'd kind of like to add to the discussion. And the future is in fact quite bright. And the future is not fossil fuel, and the future is massive investment. Just speak more. I'll just speak up. The future is in fact, massive investment all over the world, private sector investment, and largely in clean energy and clean energy systems. I think we know that that's the trajectory. The question is how we're getting through that bumpy road towards there. I'll leave it there. Maybe that's a chance for some more commentary on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Gracias.
Thank you. I'm Gracia Paramita, the co-chair of Y20 Indonesia. I have 2 points. First, it's about sharing. Regarding the blended finance or, the mix of public fund or private fund and even crowdfunding, there is an update from Indonesia. There is a foundation called Generation Indonesia. They are now developing a kind of crowdfunding. Maybe it's like Kickstarter, or in Indonesia we already got kitabisa.com, but this crowdfunding mechanism will be specifically helping green startups, any kind of initiatives for decarbonizations or related to the climate change projects, and even for the vulnerable communities who already got a lot of, impactful environmental activities. But they are now still seeking for supports. So of course they need big investments like, like creating a startup. So it's called green philanthropy. I think this is a very great initiative to respond the blended finance that Shufa already mentioned, because we cannot just depend on the government budget or even private sectors from the big companies, but this is literally from like kind of grassroots movement or the civil society movement that try to be willing to share their donation or their funding. That's number one. And number two, my question is a bit similar to Professor Frank Yotso, but maybe mine will be more specifically into how to manage the expectation. We've got enough for 2 decades to have Kyoto Protocol and then to Paris Agreement, make various ambitions towards climate targets, or even now we've got more new terms, net zero, net polluting, and etc. But how can every stakeholders, governments, civil society, and private sectors can manage the expectations if, you know, there will be big disappointments, or we can't meet the 2030 targets, or even it's going to be decreased, because I think that's what happened in Kyoto Protocol, and it's good that we revise it into Paris Agreement. So yeah, the main question is how to manage the expectation to be slightly moderate numbers or moderate targets. So yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. If is any one more intervention from the participants? Going once, going twice? No? Okay. So I will let Shufa to answer. There's a couple of questions related to loss and damage, but also in this case, I think for loss and damage, Preeti, if you can also share your thought on that, that will be great. And also Frank question, I think, to everyone, but I would like to hear the comment of Nate and also Nora. That's very much. And the last questions of Gracia, I think it's expectations. You were involved in the climate negotiation. You were very veteran in climate negotiation, so maybe you can also answer that question. So please.
Thank you. So I did touch upon the loss and damage in the sense that nobody touches upon the loss and damage. But when it came up in COP26, and I'll just give the recent development on that, and not looking at waste, but as resources that we can put back into the system. We're looking at sustainable production and consumption, because see, at the end of the day, developing nations would want to have a certain quality of life. They would like to have sustainable water and food systems and mobility systems, and it's our duty to make sure that sustainability and prosperity is for all and not just for a certain set of people. And so that cannot be done by simply focusing on a resource. The entire way that we live, the way that we define prosperity, the way that we consume individually as communities, as countries, all of these need to change, and that's going to be a very large part of India's G20 conversation, including this movement that we'll try to introduce, which was introduced at COP, called the LIFE movement, Lifestyles for Environment, which looks at individual and community behaviors, but also market mechanisms to serve more sustainable economies, and the financing for those market conditions, and industrialization, which is really nothing to do with emissions at that point of view. So I'm going to leave it with that.
Thank you. I think, Preeti, you have additional to this on loss and damage, please.
Sure. While the politics of it, will play out, we know that G77 and China have asked for this agenda item to be placed at COP27, and this probably could be the make or break issue for COP27 and the incoming Egyptian presidency. But in terms of how important it is becoming very, very important also in NDCs, where various countries have brought it to the fore on need for addressing and financing loss and damage. So it is becoming a critical part of the NDC submissions as well. There are various research collaboratives also which are helping to clear the scope of loss and damage. As you know, it is about averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. And while there are current institutions in place, for providing immediate humanitarian assistance, the loss and damage issue and scope is much beyond and larger than humanitarian assistance. So there are various think tanks, including mine, the World Resources Institute, that is helping to bring research forward to help the conversation, because as of now, the countries are talking past each other and getting mired in issues such as, is it about compensation and liability on their already existing institutions? Whereas the clear focus should be we need to find financing for loss and damage, and how can we make that happen? Be it through a facility, be it through existing institutions, or be it through an ecosystem. But that's where, the clarity on issues has to be brought forth by the research community, by the think tanks. But there are various collaborators in place, and the young person who spoke at the end, there is actually an L&D youth collaborative as well. And you may want to look at it, and I can put you in touch with them. And they're doing fantastic work to keep the issue alive, to make sure that it is not lost in political aspects of the negotiations. And Fabi, if I may, she asked a very good question about managing expectations. And how can we manage expectations? And I think, Gracia, you mentioned, should we be moderating our targets? I think if we start diluting the targets, we will lose the battle. We almost lost the battle on 1.5 degrees. And you are seeing what is happening with various ecosystems, with all the damages that are taking place. And if we start lowering and moderating our targets, we are consigning ourselves to history, if I may say so. So you as the young people have to keep us accountable for what needs to be done and what more needs to be done, rather than asking us to moderate the targets. Thank you, Fabi.
It's the challenge that young people has to ask all the generation to be accountable and take responsibilities, because your future is actually at stakes. Nate, please.
Great. So let me pick up on that comment, and Frank, thank you for the invitation to think big about what we're trying to do as a global community here, and it really does tie into that last point. I do think that it is the time to be thinking as big as possible for as quickly as possible. So 2030, 2040, we have to be thinking about fossil phase out. We have to be thinking about that on an accelerated timeline. And that's what the kind of climate imperative is in terms of what we know we need to do. Where I think that these comments maybe in some ways in my mind tie together, I would absolutely agree with the idea we are not in a time where we should be thinking about managing expectations. We, as the research community, should be raising expectations, and I think that that's always been a role for the research community, to be sort of showing the kind of importance of doing this. But I think that right now where we are is that we are also responsible for illuminating the pathway to success. That is what we need to do, because it's that Gracia, I think, that is the way that we don't need to moderate expectations. We say, here's the big expectation, and by the way, friends in the government and around civil society, here are some ways we can do it together. Here are the opportunities. Here are the pathways to success. Here are the ways that we can combine benefits with a rapid and just energy transition to deliver on a rapid and ambitious timeline. So that's kind of what I feel like our job is, and that's what we can do. Other people, the government people, other people out in civil society, they don't know sometimes, right? Like, we can work with them to help them see how they can do better, right? And I think that that's kind of how one of the things that we can share in this T20 community to help our governments that way.
Thank you. Nora, please.
Bobby, and thank you, Frank, for the wonderful question. I agree with my fellow panelists here, and I mean, this has been the spirit of T20, raising the ambition, fostering collaboration and cooperation. But at the same time, it's also a realistic discussion that's not divorced from reality. And reality tells us that, you know, the global south, developing countries are challenged, and that's why we have the principles of common but differentiated responsibility, the capacity to act. So absolutely there is more to do, and I love the image that was shown by Shuva earlier, where developed countries are sitting in a car and developing countries are riding riding a bike and they're pulling the same weight of climate action, and that's just not real. You know, developing countries have the right to emit, they have the right to develop, and developed countries must lead the way and honor their commitments of climate funds and adaptation funds that has never been materialized. So it's a collective action, but it's definitely not an equal action.
And add one sentence to that, that in the just energy transition, the just is as important as the transition. Yes. And we need to keep that in mind.
Absolutely, agree with that, Shuva.
Yeah. Cookie.
Sorry. I think agreed with all. And another role that we as a think tank or T20 can play is also to, if I can say, monitor and ensure that, you know, ensuring the transparency of implementation of plan. And I think that's something that, in a way, managing expectation is through, you mentioned that we need to, in fact, increase the expectation, but increasing expectation without us doing, like, I don't want to say a watchdog, but, you know, like monitoring and then also, you know, ensuring that things are implemented as already, you know, planned and committed. Thanks.
Thank you. We have come to the end of this session. I still have a couple of questions to ask. But before I close this, you know that Indonesia, this year, Indonesia's G20 presidencies, and we host this T20, right? Next year, India. And it's very important, I think. Also, it's happened in Asia, one of the largest economy in Asia, and a strong climate commitment, as we have heard. So my last question before we close this to all panelists, if you can be very, very brief, like 15, 20 seconds, I think. What would you suggest for the T20 to carry forward in order to have a more bold ambition?
This time. So this is my message. It's bringing in the voice of the Global South and integrating and pushing that agenda.
Yeah, I think it's similar, aligned to what Nora mentioned, and the cooperation among us, you know, among the T20 members are important, and also to help the T20 in India later to have, you know, all this issue, not only the climate, but especially we are talking about energy transition, as well as other, because I'm from TF3, so it's other environmental issues as well. So, yeah.
Well, I first want to lift up what Nora said. I think this is really exciting, this G20 Research Forum, and for the same reasons that you mentioned. So, number one on that. Number two, I think that the kind of T20 philosophy of a government-linked, but not necessarily government-driven research set of collaborations, I think we should be always thinking about how we can be, as our groups, this group's here, but also broader in our countries, how we can do more of that kind of work. And so I think that that is really important about how we learn from each other, how we then feed back to our governments.
Pretty.
Well, I just have one pointed intervention: solidarity with vulnerable countries, and if possible, you know, reach out to the V20 and the Climate Vulnerable Forum so that G20 is not seen as an exclusive club. Thank you.
Thank you. Shuva, last.
And the final thing I want to say is that the T20 needs to also bridge the gap between research and policy making, because G20 at the end of the day is a policy negotiation platform and not a research-based platform. So our data and our analytics and our research must feed constructively into that policy-making process. We must reach out to other stakeholders, other engagement groups, the working groups, and make sure that the overall economic policy that is discussed has sustainability at its core.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We have come to the end of our session. Please give a big round of applause to our panelists. Excellent. Thank you very much to all panelists again, and thank you for your questions, your participation in this session. And I think before we end that, can we take a picture together? Yeah, that's the Indonesian way, I think. Please.